Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's really great to see so many of you here. So this is a webinar on the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard as part of the Green Infrastructure Framework. Well, I'm going to just set out what we're covering in the agenda, and then I'll hand over to Jane Houghton, who's going to lead us through the next sort of bit of introduction. So here's the programme for the rest of the hour. We're covering an overview of the Green Infrastructure Framework, which Jane Houghton will cover. Then we've got an introduction to the Urban Tree Canopy Cover with Jim Smith from the Forestry Commission. We've got some case study examples from Bryan Cosgrove from Manchester City of Trees, and then we've got a Q&A session which will be led by Tina Shilleto from Forestry Commission. So I will hand over now to Jane to talk us through a little bit of the background in terms of where the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard sits within the wider Green Infrastructure Framework. So thank you very much, Jane.
Many thanks, Claire, and hello everyone. I'm very pleased to provide a very brief introduction to the Green Infrastructure Framework of Principles and Standards for England. This aims to set the scene today, and it's really for people on the call who are new to the GI framework. I know many of you will already be familiar with it, having attended the launch in January this year, but hopefully this is a useful refresh. So developing the GI framework is a commitment in the government's 25-year environment plan, and it aims to improve existing and create more good quality green infrastructure for all the many benefits it can provide. And we want to ensure that everyone has access to good quality green infrastructure and focus on where provision is poorest and in areas of low income and health inequalities. And we want to support local authorities in refreshing their local plans and then mainstream GI as a key asset in creating and maintaining sustainable places. The GI framework's development was overseen by a cross-government steering group, and we also benefited hugely from a 70-strong advisory group and from testing the drafts with local authorities and developers. So overall, the Green Infrastructure Framework contains principles of good green infrastructure, national headline green infrastructure standards, and I'll focus on both the principles and standards in the next slides. But just to say that there's also a GI mapping database, which last year won a Government Geography Award, and this now includes over 100 data sets of green and blue infrastructure with social and economic information, and these can be downloaded and added to local data for use in local GI exercises. And there's also a Green Infrastructure Planning and Design Guide, how to design good quality GI. And this really aims to support local authorities in developing design codes for green infrastructure, working with the National Model Design Code. And of course, design codes will become mandatory through the planning reforms. So we hope this will be very useful for local authorities. And then finally, the process journeys. These are step-by-step guides on how to apply the framework for different sectors. There's one for planners, one for developers, and one for neighbourhood planning groups. So essentially, we have a greening toolbox. And there's full information about all these components on the GI Framework website, along with training videos, which we're adding to. So focusing in on the GI principles. There are 15 and they underpin the whole GI framework. They set out the why, the what and the how of good GI. So in the centre we've got the 5 why principles. These explain why we do GI in terms of the benefits and outcomes that it can deliver. So places that are nature rich and beautiful, active and healthy, thriving and prospering, climate resilient, and that have improved water management. And there are 5 descriptive principles in the orange circles describing what good GI looks like. So multifunctional, varied, connected, accessible, and responding to local character. And then finally 5 how or process principles in green: partnership and vision, evidence, planning strategically, good design, and well managed, valued and evaluated. And we've got full information about the principles on the website. This slide introduces the 5 headline green infrastructure standards. These are voluntary standards and they support the National Planning Policy Framework. They'll also complement mandatory mechanisms such as biodiversity net gain and the local nature recovery strategies. They include, firstly, the Green Infrastructure Strategy Standard. And this says that every local authority should produce a GI strategy applying the principles and the standards, and that all major developments should develop a GI plan. And secondly, we've got the accessible green space standards that cover quantity, capacity and quality of accessible green and blue spaces, and that includes their accessibility and inclusion. A key commitment in the government's environmental improvement plan is linked to these accessible green space standards and is led by DEFRA. And they say that commitment says that everyone should live within 15 minutes walk of a green or blue space, and that government will work to reduce barriers which prevent people from accessing green and blue spaces. Thirdly, we've got the Urban Nature Recovery Standard, and this aims to increase the percentage of urban green infrastructure that's designed and managed for nature recovery, including an increase in the number and the quality of local nature reserves and local wildlife sites. And then fourthly, the Urban Greening Factor Standard, which aims for at least 40% average green cover in urban residential neighbourhoods. And by green cover, we mean vegetation, soil and water as opposed to man-made surface. And the standard also includes a new planning tool, the Urban Greening Factor, which sets a minimum score for the quantity and the quality of GI in new developments, and that score is set in local planning policy. And finally, there's the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, which Jim will talk about shortly. So each of these standards distinguishes between the recommended levels of achievement when they're applied at an area-wide scale and for major new developments using the MPPF definition. So I hope that whistle-stop tour of the GI framework has been helpful context for today's session, and many thanks for listening. And I'm now delighted to introduce Jim Smith, our next speaker. And Jim is the Forestry Commission's National Urban Forestry Adviser. He's a well-known and very well-respected figure in the urban forestry field, and he's often the go-to technical expert for topics as diverse as managing subsidence risks to street design and urban tree health. So many thanks, and over to you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jane. Trees are now tier 1 in terms of government policy, and that's really come from the manifesto commitment for all new streets to have trees planted on, but also the net zero commitments in terms of tree planting more widely. And that's flowed really, the manifesto commitment for new trees on streets has flowed from the government's response to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission's report, Living with Beauty. Some of you may be familiar with that. And this is kind of really set in place the government's commitment as more general policy is in the England Tree Actions Plan. But in terms of urban tree canopy cover, the science and knowledge section of the England Tree Action Plan commits the government to working towards getting better data, quality of data and better information so that we can have not just better quality tree canopy cover, but better understanding of our tree resource altogether. And that's where the England Tree Action Plan comes in. And the Forestry Commission, in conjunction with its advisory body, the Urban Forest and Woodland Advisory Committee Network, which is one of our advisory bodies, produced this document in conjunction with Forest Research called England's Urban Forest. And it was about using tree canopy cover data to secure the benefits of the urban forest. And it's a very useful little sort of ready reckoner on why tree canopy cover is useful, why you should be, as local authorities, you should be beginning to collect it, and who, in the context of the professionals who have access to that data, who's going to be using it, people like tree officers, landscape architects, to a certain extent highway engineers as well. So and it gives a very good sort of snapshot of some of the initial work that Forest Research did in capturing tree canopy cover across England, and I'll say a bit more about that later. So the biggest issue for increasing tree canopy cover in towns is accommodating the desired future growth of the tree, and that's often an aspect that people forget when they're planting in urban areas. But cities are artificial creations, and trees are living, breathing organisms that require the same basic needs as humans to thrive. So they need space, water, air, light and nutrients. And people often forget that the canopy cover that's above ground level is also represented in a ratio with the root mass below that, and it's a 1:5 ratio. So 20% of the tree's biomass is actually underground, and people forget that often. So unlike other assets like buildings, roads and urban infrastructure, they do not remain static. They grow, change their state, and their needs and requirements alter over time. So what do you do with an asset? Well, the institution of asset managers recommends that if you're managing an asset anywhere, it doesn't have to be in the urban environment. If you're managing an asset, you should be spending between 1% and I think 1.5% of that asset's total value on its annual upkeep. So the only way you can do that really is to measure it and understand what your baseline is. And then once you've measured it, then you can begin to value it and understand what that value is for your area and your local residents and the businesses that operate in that area. And there are a number of different systems and methodologies available, and to a certain extent the tree world has been a bit more advanced in doing this type of operation, this type of measuring and valuation exercise than the green infrastructure area, because a lot of this has been derived from work that was done in the States quite a long time ago, about 25 years ago, and it's been developed over the time. And the iTree ecosystem was developed by the US Forest Service and adapted for use in the UK, and that looks at the ecosystem service values of trees, and it monetizes it as well. So, and then on a sort of a smaller scale, sort of less intensive, there's the iTree. One of the suites of iTree tools is the iTree Canopy, which looks at measuring tree canopy cover from pixelated aerial photography. So that's that can be done. That's also been adapted for use in the UK and is very effective. And that's really the one, not necessarily iTree Canopy, but that's the one that Forest Research have been using in terms of our National Forest Inventory and capturing trees outside woodlands, which is going to be published fairly shortly, I think. So, and then we've got CAVAT, which is not about canopy cover, but it's about the structural value of trees, and that's the capital asset value for amenity trees, and that's used by a lot of local authorities already to value the trees, their street tree populations and other populations of trees not under their control. And then we've got the TreeZilla, the monster map of trees, which is a joint venture by Forest Research and the Open University, produced what I would describe it as being almost like a DIY version of iTree Eco. So it uses iTree Eco and iTree Canopy as a base, but local residents can look at their trees in their street and in their neighbourhood, or even in their back gardens, and enter the details for them and get valuations for those trees and also canopy cover for them. So that's really useful. There is a website. Had I been able to show my slides, there was a website which is the Forest Research and Tree Economics website about urban canopy cover in the UK, and it's www.urbancanopycover.org. So do have a look at that, and we can provide that website later if you want to in the chat. I'll do that in the chat later on. So the green, as Jane has quite rightly said, the Green Infrastructure Framework has this new Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, and we think it's currently the best and the easiest metric for measuring success, because there's a lot of, as I've mentioned, there's various methodologies out there, but if you can establish what the baseline canopy cover is for your area, then it gives you a tool and a mechanism for moving forward from that point. There also is now a national statutory tree and woodland canopy cover target, which is 16.5%. But that, I just want to clarify with you that that's not the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard. That's government's take on where we should, what the England-wide canopy cover for woodlands and trees outside woodlands should be. That's the target going forward. Also, many local authorities have already interestingly got some policy targets for increasing tree canopy cover in their area, and a few have already done these sorts of assessments, and that I'm giving a couple of examples later. But the really interesting one is the one that Bryan will be talking about in a few minutes. So, and from that leaflet, the Urban FWAC Network leaflet, the research that Forest Research did demonstrated there's a huge spectrum of canopy cover, existing canopy cover sort of percentages across local authorities and areas and built up areas across England, from Fleetwood, which is a coastal town which only has a canopy cover of 3%, to Farnham, which is somewhere to the west of England, west of London, I think, or Reading, to 45%. A massive difference, and that's what we're looking at. And that's one of the reasons when we were developing the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, and the information and feedback we got back from our Urban FWAC network members and also from local authorities was that one size, one percentage wouldn't fit all. So we had to develop it. So we developed in the way that we have here. So the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, as published in the GI framework, is area-wide, as Jane has said. It's urban tree canopy cover is increased by an agreed percentage based on a locally defined baseline. So you do your baseline, and then taking into account local needs, opportunities and constraints. So you get an uplift from that baseline, and local authorities know their areas best, so they'll be able to determine what is a suitable uplift that they can then do year on year. Hopefully, that would be the suggestion. And on major development, major residential and commercial development is designed to meet these targets and needs, and that's where there's real opportunities, because often some of the constraints in the area-wide implementation of this canopy cover would be the existing infrastructure. For instance, Edwardian and Victorian buildings on clay soils, shrinkable clay soils, might inhibit the local authority's ability to get very large trees in proximity to those buildings. Whereas if you're doing a major new development with residential properties and you're building new foundations on that shrinkable clay soil, you can accommodate the presence of those trees going forward, and that's what this is all about. And then new and existing trees are incorporated into new developments, and new streets are tree lined. So I would suggest that the opportunities for increasing canopy cover are in both area wide and major development, but in terms of integrating it, those trees, so there are no, or you reduce the problems that urban trees can sometimes cause. It's major development is where the really gains, the good gains are going to be made, because that's where you can create infrastructure to accommodate the presence of large landscape trees. So Torbay Council was the very first local authority in England to do an iTree survey, and they did that in 2010, and they did an iTree survey which covered the density of trees. But interestingly, what they've done is they're also the very first local authority council in England to revisit that survey. So they did the first survey in 2010 and a second follow-up one in 2021, and that's what this publication is. And interestingly, they dropped their numbers of trees dropped by about 200,000 from 2010 to 2021. So it's on the face of it, that sounds pretty dire. And the tree density went from 109 down to 71. However, tree canopy cover increased from 11.8% to 18.2%, a jump of 6.4%. So that's a really interesting metric that highlighted the fact in Torbay that some of that tree loss numerically was from woodland areas that had thinnings done and trees were allowed to grow up, but also some loss on development sites as well. But for me, what that metric tells us is that it isn't just about numbers. Increasing your tree canopy cover isn't about numbers. It's looking after the trees that you've got and ensuring that you can get good quality large landscape trees, which then grow into have big canopies. And Torbay has demonstrated that it's often qualitative. If you want to increase your canopy cover, it's just as much qualitative as it is quantitative. Wickham Council, District Council, they did their tree canopy cover assessment, and what they were able to do, I won't go into much detail because I'm sort of 3/4 through, but they were able to actually base a lot of their policies and strategic changes that they've made in terms of their operational work on having done their baseline canopy cover survey, which gave them a 25% canopy cover, which is pretty good, really. You'd expect that in that part of the world, though. That enabled them to challenge themselves, put more resources into managing their tree stock, and also make some really good and, shall we say, important policy changes that, and then enable them to keep that tempo up and keep that canopy cover not just where it is, so that you didn't get a backward trend, but increasing it. And that's what the tree canopy cover standard is all about. Establish your baseline and then move forward from that. And I've gone into just a very quick touching on a development site, because as we learned from Torbay, that often it's trees on development sites that get lost, the big canopy ones. But here, this is the Angel building in Islington in N1. That building on the left is the new building, but the previous building there was the old British Telecom headquarters in Angel. But those trees that you can see there are pre-existing trees that went round the side of the building. And what was important here was that as I mentioned on Torbay, the importance of trying to retain trees on site. And what they did here was they used the footprint of the old building as the boundary for the footprint of the new building. Often on development sites, they chip away at the surrounding area and remove trees because of that. But on this site, because Islington Council had some really strong policies, they didn't do that, and they were able to integrate the new building really, really well into the existing trees, but also planted some really, really important large landscape trees in place, and also some additional green infrastructure there you see there, which contributed to a green infrastructure barrier for air quality for the people who inhabit the building. And so evidence shows that that's the type of mix of green infrastructure and trees that goes to improve air quality in those areas. So this is the Kingsway from central London, and this was a photograph taken from the London Development Plan 1951, which was the development plan for the Abercrombie plan for reconstructing London after the war. And these trees were planted, I think, around 1949, 1950. And this is what they look like now. Photo was taken in 2009, I think it was. And the difference in time between this slide and then the next slide, please, Claire, is about 60 years. Thank you. It's about 60 years. And the reason when I first started using these slides, when I first joined the Forestry Commission, I used to say, oh, that's the 2050, 2080 high emissions scenario. And we've got all this time, we've got 60 years to do what we need to do in terms of improving canopy cover. But that has changed radically in the last 10 years, where we now know that those issues are coming thick and fast at us. So for us to be able to meet the challenges that we're going to get from climate resilience, climate change, and making our cities more resilient, we're really going to need to increase canopy cover quite radically over the next few years. And that's why the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard encourages local authorities to make those increases where they can and take the opportunities where they can. So that's me done. Thank you very much for listening. I'm just going to introduce now Bryan Cosgrove from Manchester City of Trees.
So I was just going to speak a little bit about how we investigated Greater Manchester's tree canopy using iTree to highlight that value by quantifying the ecosystem services that we believe it's delivering for the city region. And then also how we used data to highlight where we think we need to be planting more trees to realise more of those benefits, so where they're needed the most. I just want to say a little bit about who we are, who City of Trees are. We're the community forest for Greater Manchester. For those of you who aren't familiar, Greater Manchester is a collection of 10 individual local authorities with a combined authority over the top. So that's 10 planning authorities, then with the combined authority that has a strategic role in looking at planning and the environment, amongst other things. We're also, we're one of 13 community forests across England, I should say, and we're also the Greater Manchester chunk of the Northern Forest Initiative. And our role is really just to get trees in the ground, manage the trees we've already got, and to help connect people with trees and woodlands and sort of generate a woodland loving culture across Greater Manchester. In about 2017, 2018, it became apparent that rather than just working on a conveyor belt of projects, what we needed was a really coherent plan for Greater Manchester, and we were going to have to write it for Greater Manchester. And also that if we wanted that to look like a Greater Manchester document, look like a Greater Manchester strategy, we were going to have to communicate in natural capital terms. Greater Manchester was very, very excited about the new natural capital approaches. And so we knew that we needed to, for a start, we needed to baseline that. And that baseline was going to have to talk about natural capital terms. We already had, from 2010, we had already commissioned a piece of work. This is basically using blue sky mapping, the tree audit, which gave us a great wealth of information about where our trees were, and it shows us all of the broad patterns that of tree cover, and it gave us a figure of about 16% tree cover. But what it doesn't do is show us what condition they're in or tell us what they're doing for us. So with some expert support from Jim and others, we undertook our own iTree Eco survey. So that involved, for an area as large as Greater Manchester, that involved us going out and physically surveying about 700 survey plots across Greater Manchester. And so that was a mammoth task. We had about 78 surveyors coming through City of Trees over the summer, going out in pairs to survey all of these locations and bringing back a whole wealth of information about tree size, canopy size, condition, health, species, all of that. All of that information is fed into the iTree Eco sausage machine, and out of that then comes some really, really useful information that we were able to use to communicate. So this went in all of our comms. We were able to prepare plans for each of the districts and for the Greater Manchester or Combined Authority as well, to really explain what what that canopy is doing and what that means for us in terms of cash terms as well. So happily, the figure we got in terms of the number of trees, so 11 million trees, 15.7% canopy cover, that chimed already with what we understood from the GM tree audit. So we were happy that this was telling us, that this was a fairly accurate figure we were getting out for this model. That each year we're sequestering 56,000 tons of carbon, and all of this stuff. And subsequently, some of these data have then been used in other strategies produced by Greater Manchester. So that was a real win for us. The next bit, as I said, we wanted to look at where we needed to be planting more trees. So where, if we're saying the trees can do all of these good things, where, if we have a limited budget for tree planting, where should we be focusing our attention? And so what we started to do was the first point was to identify where we think we could put trees in Greater Manchester. So all of those green areas on that map there are areas that we have decided are plantable. They're not all soft surfaces. What we did was we took an ordnance survey layer of Greater Manchester. We removed everything that we thought absolutely couldn't be planted. So critical infrastructure, buildings, roads, railways, and protected landscapes. Priority habitats, removed all of those, and then everything that was left we've decided is plantable. So some of that is hard landscaping, some of that is wide pavements, some of that is car parks, where we can argue a case that there's room for trees to be put in there. And so what we did with that then was to overlay that plantable map with different data sets that imply where the need is quite great. So we looked at air quality for one thing there. So this is particulates PM2.5's map, and we filtered that down. So we set a threshold level for that, overlaid those worst areas onto our plantable map. And so we can look then at which areas we think that we need to be planting trees into to really to help scrub particulates from the atmosphere. I used a 2-scale scoring system there. So that dark green area that represents the plantable areas around a primary school. We just wanted to highlight that some residents and areas were more vulnerable to air pollution than others, and that we might want to look at those as a priority. Another element we looked at was urban heat island. So this was using a piece of work produced by the University of Manchester to look at where they predicted we would regularly see temperatures exceeding 29.7 degrees in the summer months. That threshold is important because that's the threshold at which the NHS deploy their heat stress resources. And so this represents cash being spent. So we wanted to look at where we could actually plant trees to bring those temperatures down in the summertime. We also looked at flood risk and water quality, and these maps are actually, we just borrowed from the Environment Agency's working with natural processes mapping. So we've got riparian planting, priority areas, wider catchment planting. And we also looked at where we had high risk of surface water flooding. So we wanted to ensure that we were intercepting water that would otherwise be causing a nuisance, causing surface water flood issues. We had there were about 16 different data sets that we organized into about 6 baskets or 6 ecosystem services, and there was a real focus in there, although we were looking at health and well-being as well, and deprivation. A real focus for us there was on resilience. Manchester's had severe issues with flooding in the past, and as you could see from that heat island map there, it's expected to have some issues in the future with high temperatures. So we really wanted to focus on climate resilience. So when we combined all of those different data sets together, what we have here is a combined priority map. And so where you've got those redder areas, that represents the areas where tree planting would hit the highest number of the ecosystem services that we included in our scope there. So we can either use this map as a tool for highlighting individual places and prioritizing those, or we can pick out those individual ecosystem benefits or those environmental issues and tell a story to planners or to businesses or to residents about where we can use trees to tackle those issues. I just wanted to highlight this one. This shows quite well that some of our big priority areas or the reddest areas are actually in the city centre on those pavements where we think we've got room to plant trees into. So how we use this since, so all of this work, this all went into our GM Tree and Woodland Strategy for Greater Manchester that was published in 2019. That was referenced in the Greater Manchester Spatial Strategy. In our plan, we didn't talk about a future canopy target. We actually used a numeric tree planting target because we really wanted to stimulate activity and make it a collective action piece. And so we used a target of 3 million trees within a generation. So that was a tree for every resident of Greater Manchester within a generation. That is, people like that, residents like that, it makes sense to them, but we are now working with the combined authority to look at a canopy target as well, and we may well split that between area wide and development as well. It's informed local tree strategies. It's definitely helps us to secure funding to have a coherent plan. All of the need maps or the new planting maps, they were used in our local nature recovery strategy pilot, and it's been the data has also been used to inform emerging landscape recovery scheme proposals as well. And I think that's it. That's me.
Thank you so much, Bryan. That was absolutely brilliant. Some fantastic examples there from Greater Manchester and the work you've done in City of Trees, and really useful sort of follow on from Jim's really helpful presentation around the standard. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Tina Shilleto, who is the Head of Planning, Infrastructure and Built Environment at the Forestry Commission, just to chair us in our question and answer session. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Claire, much appreciated. And thanks, Bryan and Jim, for really interesting presentations. They were brilliant. So as Claire said, I'm Head of Planning, Infrastructure, Built Environment and Forestry Commission. I've been lucky enough to be involved in the Green Infrastructure Framework's development from its very, very early days. And I'm really delighted that we've got this Urban Tree Canopy Cover standard as part of the framework, and delighted to see you all here today as well. We have one question in the Q&A. That question is, do any of the panel have experience of the Urban Tree Calculator and the DEPRA metric for BNG? And if so, can you comment on both how it's structured and how it's actually used in practice? I'm going to hand this one over, no surprise for you, Jim. Jim has been heavily involved in the metric again for some time. So Jim, can I hand that one over to you?
Yeah, so the 2.0 version of the metric didn't really identify individual trees or urban trees as separate, and the subsequent version that we worked with colleagues in DEFRA and Natural England on, I'm really pleased to say decided to include individual trees separately, and that's why we've got the urban tree helper metric. But the background to it was really important that in getting that the biodiversity net gain metric for trees together that people, it was an easy to use process, and it used calculations that were already well understood in the development sector and in local authorities. And for that reason, we decided to use root protection area as the baseline calculation. Largely, and that's from the British Standard 5837, which is the development standard for used when you're building near trees. And the root protection area calculation is based on the size of the trunk, and it actually describes how much the root of a tree should be protected. But what it also does is, because of the one I mentioned it in my presentation, there's a 1 to 5 average, 1 to 5, 1 to 6 possibly ratio from root to shoot, and that's across the plant kingdom, but specifically for trees, that ratio. So what it does is, it by proxy, if you measure the root protection area and it's converted into hectares, you get a proxy measurement of the amount of biomass that's likely to be that tree is likely to be supporting, and the biomass is one of the indicators of its biodiversity value. So we went that way. It's fairly rough and ready. We're perfectly happy to accept that. It doesn't differentiate between species yet, and Natural England colleagues and DEFRA, we were discussing that in some of our development programs. It might do in the future, it might go down to species level, but at the moment it was just an easy to use metric. And so the calculation behind that tree helper is that it's the root protection area plus squared to give you hectares of surface area, which is then a proxy for the biomass biomass and therefore the biodiversity that tree provides in terms of the metric, and then the units are calculated from that. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
So yeah, Bryan, you are the star of the show. So we will ask you, where did you get your urban heat island map layer from, and is it a national data set?
That's a piece of work that was developed by the University of Manchester. It was a program called Ask You, looking at climate change impacts. So that is only available for Greater Manchester, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Bryan. I'm still going through these. So what measures can we be taking to ensure our trees are resilient to climate change? Should we be risk assessing our native stock in a heavily urbanised area? And how do you think we consider the balance between natives and exotics? Jim, I think this is probably another one for you.
Yeah. That's a very good question, and one that comes up a lot. I think what we have to understand is that natives are excellent, and I hope my Natural England colleagues don't think I'm talking heresy here, but natives are excellent. But we've got to understand that going forward, particularly in urban areas, where most urban areas are like 9 degrees hotter than the surrounding countryside, particularly Greater London and places like Manchester, there's a big differential. So the trees that are growing and planted in those areas have to be able to cope with that heat stress and all the other stresses that go with that. But for hundreds of years, we've been planting trees from all over the world in our city centres, in our towns. And my attitude as an urban forester and an arboriculturalist is that you pick the tree that's most suitable for the location. And if you know that it's a hostile location, you pick a tree capable of tolerating that. And unfortunately, many of our native species are not able to do that. That's why you don't see many oak trees in the centre of towns, and increasingly I think birch in city centres are going to suffer because of the dry conditions and things like that. So we have to adapt. Part of surviving as a society is adapting to the changing circumstances. So my attitude would be, if you can plant natives, do so. Do that in spades where you can. But for street trees and very urbanised, very hot glazed spaces that have high reflective values, where those are very hostile areas, we should be picking trees that are able to accommodate that, and they don't come from England or the UK, they come from other parts of the world. Having said that, I think one of the things I like to add to that, and it's in the biodiversity net gain metric as part of the sort of background information, is that a lot of those trees, exotics, can provide just as much in the way of food resource and habitat as some of our native ones as well, particularly in urban contexts. So we shouldn't be thinking of it as one against the other. We should be thinking, let's pick the one that's right for the place.
Thanks, Jim. Bryan, a couple for you. First off, what level of resources did you require to complete your project in regards to skilled staff to carry out the mapping and overlays, the interaction with volunteers and so on? And did you have specific people doing specific roles like funding, GIS, GPS, that kind of stuff?
Okay, so we did have very specific roles. So I was the GIS resource on that project. We also had a couple of people who were managing all of those surveys. As I said, we had about 78 surveyors in total came through. In terms of training, we had a wonderful day's training from Jim, who told us all about his experiences on, I believe, on a motorbike surveying sites in London. And we also used Tree Canopy, sorry, almost forgot. We used a company called Tree Canopy who were able to give us again, it was about a day of training there. The tool comes with a lot of guidance and support with it, so you can download all the packs. And so we just studied those, and then we trained. And once we'd had our training, we just passed that on then. And so we would have our surveyors would come through in groups throughout the summer there, and then we'd have training sessions for them. So that was, I think that picks up about the human resource. It did cost quite a lot of money. We didn't use volunteers. We thought that there was a risk in terms of the quality of work if we used purely volunteers. Also, that continuity might be an issue. So we did decide to pay all of those surveys that came through. And we were supported by the Forestry Commission and by the Combined Authority, and we had private donations as well to help us achieve that. I hope that answers that.
Thanks, Bryan. Jim, not to put you on the spot here, but obviously Bryan's experiences of a fully funded, fully costed, delivered project over a very large scale. I'm sure there are other examples out there where it's been smaller scale, perhaps volunteer-led. Are there any of those that you could share with us?
In terms of iTree?
Yeah,
that would be the London one. That was done on a shoestring. So, and Jane will know because she was one of the volunteers. So, but I think it's the lessons learned from that was you've got to fund it properly. And if we had over 300 volunteers, you've got to have enough people to be able to corral and manage those. So very definitely. There are other smaller scale projects around the country, I think, that Forest Research have done. But it's interesting that even in the States, because iTree, I'm going to broaden it out a bit now. iTree was developed in the States to be a volunteer citizen science project originally, and that's how it was done. But even in the States, when they did the very large scale ones, like the greater Illinois ones, they used professionals, and they gave them all four-wheel. I used to chuckle because they gave them all four-wheel drive vehicles and all the equipment they could need, and we had some string and some rope and a few sticks in London, sort of thing. So very different. That's not to say that you can't do it. I know that there's some tree warden groups in North London did do some work themselves, and they operated that themselves using very minimal equipment, and it can be done. But if you're doing a large scale project, you need proper resourcing and proper admin backup and things like that.
Right, thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Bryan, another one for you. How do you overcome barriers for getting trees into the ground, for example, in paved areas?
Yeah, thankfully that's I have colleagues who deal with that side of things, but they do regularly come up against issues there. And the main objection or the main challenge that they face is trying to convince the local authorities that the below ground services can be dealt with and that the tree can be accommodated alongside them. And the way we try to overcome that is really by promoting pavement support systems such as Green Blue Urban crate products. So Stratacell, I think, is one. Although that does make the schemes expensive, but that's, we always explain that you really need that. We can get the tree in there and we can accommodate the services. However, we are going to need to invest in that to make that work.
Thanks, Bryan. Jim, another one for you. When predicting canopy cover from new planting, is it best to use a 25-year or mature size prediction or specialist arbor advice given species growing conditions?
I think all the advice is go for, if when you plant a tree, the expectation is it will reach maturity. That's why you're doing it. So you should, many of the nurseries now provide that mature canopy cover size. It might not go down to meterage. Sometimes they do small, medium and large, that sort of thing. And then you can extrapolate that yourself. But I would, if you're planting it, don't do it. 25 years is not a long time for trees in urban areas. I mean, the average street tree in London, if I remember correctly, was about 25 to 30, but that's because they were cherries and birch, mostly, sort of thing. If you're planting, what we need to be doing is planting long-lived, large species, large canopy trees. And for that, go for the maximum canopy size. And I had some discussions with one of our colleagues, Naomi, one of the economists in Forestry Commission. And the first 10 years, when you're investing in tree planting, the first 10 years is basically money, not money down the drain, but it's money invested. You don't get those returns on those trees until they reach that latter part of their life, when they've developed over their full species potential. So in terms of canopy cover predictions, go for the maximum and try and achieve it.
So thinking about the future, what do the panelists hope our aims and targets will be in 5 years' time? So
are you should ask me first. Well, okay, my big one is for there to be parity between built infrastructure and trees. I would like to see trees. I'm not committing government to anything, but I would like to see trees to be a statutory function. I think they're the 6th utility after gas, water, electric, telecom, and all the other stuff sort of thing. I think those trees, the trees that provide all the services for us in urban areas, their roots have every much right to be in the ground next to those utility services as anything else, and that's what I'd like to see in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Jim. Claire?
I'm going to come on to some next steps, Tina, so I'll cover that when I wrap up.
Great, thank you. Jane, anything from you?
I hope that in 5 years' time, our targets will include Professor Kaneinendijk's 330-300 rule for urban forests. And you may know it, this says that everyone should be able to see at least 3 trees from their home. There should be 30% tree canopy cover in each neighbourhood, and homes should be no more than 300 metres from their nearest high-quality public green space.
That's a nice one. Yeah. Brian, anything from you to finish off?
I would only really echo what Jim said. That's been a big part of our mission, has been to pitch trees and green infrastructure as infrastructure, and to combat the kind of attitudes that we get in planning officers' meetings where they talk about ideas such as concrete structures that can suck carbon from the atmosphere, and I have to aghast just explain that, well, just challenge them by saying, who's going to want to read a book underneath one of those, or who's going to sit beneath one of those and have a coffee? Well, we can do that with a tree.
Right, thanks, Brian. And yeah, I suppose all of those myself as well. I think we are now out of time, so Claire, I'll hand over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tina, for chairing that. Thank you, panel. I'm just going to wrap up then with finally sort of share my screen with some next steps from a Natural England perspective. So it's been really great to have the sort of experts on the panel here, and what we're going to be looking at over the next sort of 6 to 9 months is particularly sort of working through Natural England's sort of area teams, offering advice to local authorities through a sort of package of training and development projects over the next sort of 6 to 9 months. We'll also be developing user guides for the standards. So each of the standards will have a sort of a more detailed user guide associated with them, and we'll be providing some further sort of online training for each of those standards. So we've got one coming up on urban greening factor, for example. We will also be undertaking a sort of a baseline survey for future evaluation of the green infrastructure framework, and then we will be seeking feedback on the headline standards through a stakeholder survey in due course. That's kind of wrapping up what we'll be doing and the sort of next steps in terms of the green infrastructure framework itself. I also noticed that we had sort of feedback through the polls, so thank you for sort of entering your feedback on the polls. So at the start of the session, you rated your understanding of the subject at 3.1. Hopefully, when you leave, you will also be able to provide that rating so we can see how effective the session has been in terms of increasing sort of understanding, but also in terms of that canopy survey data that you provided feedback for us on in the middle of Jim's slot. So 40% of you said that you didn't know, but 40% of you had also got up-to-date canopy survey data completed in the last 5 years, and 20% of you were interested in developing a survey. So some useful food for thought there. And I think the next sort of question we would want to ask, and we may be able to sort of pose this to you afterwards, is what are the barriers really to being able to do that kind of baseline survey? So we will wrap up there. I think we're just coming into to the end of the session. It's been a really informative session. Thank you all for joining. Particular thanks to Jim Smith and Tina Shilleto from the Forestry Commission, and to Bryan Cosgrove from Manchester City of Trees for those really helpful presentations and question and answer sessions. And thank you to my colleague Jane Houghton also for setting the scene. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much everyone for joining, and do finish off with the final poll before you leave.